For a long time, I couldn't understand the moment my life became unnecessary for others. Not suddenly, but gradually, like the writing on an old sign fades. First the letters fade, then entire words disappear, and one day you look and can no longer remember what was written there. I guess it all started when my children started talking to me a little faster than I could respond. When their glances increasingly slid past me, as if I were not the person they were talking to, but a background. I've always tried not to be heavy, not to impose myself, not to remind others of my presence unnecessarily. This comes with age, the ability to shrink, to take up less space, to speak more quietly. At first, it seems polite. Then you realize it's protection. Because the world doesn't like the weak and the slow. When my husband died, I was truly alone for the first time. Not in the sense that there weren't people around. There were people, calls, questions, advice. But there was no one who knew me without words. No one who understood my pauses. With him, the silence was alive. Without him, it became empty. The children talked a lot about caring then, about how I couldn't be alone, about how they were going through so much. I listened and believed. I wanted to believe, because faith in loved ones is the last thing an old person clings to. If you let go of that, all that's left is the anticipation of the end. When they said they were going on vacation, I was actually happy for them. They were tired, it was obvious. Work, worries, the constant rush. I said I understood that they needed to rest. I smiled into the phone, trying to keep my voice cheerful. And then they carefully added that maybe it would be better for me to spend this time alone. Completely alone. Because it's easier that way. Because it's calmer. Because it's more comfortable. The word more comfortable hung between us like a chill. They didn't say it out loud, but I heard it. Old people hear what young people hide between the lines. I hung up and sat motionless for a long time. The apartment was quiet. The clock ticked too loudly. I suddenly felt clearly that my presence in their lives had become something to consider when planning a vacation. Something they wanted to get away from for a while, so as not to spoil their comfort. I wasn't offended right away. Resentment comes later. First comes shame. For being needy. For being afraid alone. For being here at all. Those days, I tried to convince myself it wasn't so bad. That I could handle it. That a few weeks was nothing. I'd been strong my whole life. I raised children when things were tough.
I said, I endured, I kept silent.
Couldn't I endure the silence now? But the nights turned out to be longer than I expected. The silence in the dark becomes loud. Every rustle feels like a threat. Every sound reminds me that if something happens, no one will come right away. I caught myself afraid to fall asleep. Because sleep is also loneliness, only deeper. I looked at my phone and didn't want to call first. I didn't want to be that old mother who ruined my vacation. I imagined them, the sun, the sea, the ease. And myself, here, in the dim light, with a blanket and pills on the nightstand. These two images didn't match. And that was what made it especially painful. Sometimes I wondered, maybe there's something wrong with me? Maybe I really have become too complicated? Too slow? Too real for their fast-paced world? These thoughts gnawed at me from within, quietly, without a scream. It's not the body that crumbles, it's the feeling of being needed that crumbles. But it was in that silence that something I hadn't yet realized began to happen. Something inside me slowly awakened. Not anger.
No.
More like memory. the memory that I was a person long before I became someone's mother, that I had a life, a voice, a choice, and that perhaps loneliness isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's a mirror. I didn't yet know that this abandonment would be the beginning, not the end, not a fall, but something else. Something that would turn me inside out and force me to look at myself, not through the eyes of those who chose comfort, but through my own. After they left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the courtyard gradually empty. Cars pulled out one after another, people rushed about their business, and only I remained in place, as if they'd forgotten to turn me off along with the lights. I didn't cry. The tears hadn't come yet. It felt like something inside me had frozen, quieted, as if waiting to figure out whether this was temporary or permanent. The first few days I held on. I did everything as usual. I got up, made tea, opened the window. I told myself it was just a break, that the children had a right to rest, that I was a grown woman and I could handle it. I repeated these words like a prayer, but they didn't take hold, because behind them, there wasn't confidence, but an attempt not to feel. The phone was silent. I knew they were busy, that they had the sun, the sea, other concerns. I didn't want to disturb them. I completely stopped wanting to be heard. This feeling comes on unnoticed. At first you think you shouldn't bother them, but then you realize you don't even know what you could possibly talk about. That night, I felt worse. Not suddenly, not scary. My blood pressure just rose higher than usual. I sat on my bed, holding the blood pressure monitor in my hands, and suddenly realized, if things get really bad now, I'll be alone. This thought was as cold as water. It didn't frighten me. It sobered me up. I took a pill and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to myself, to every heartbeat, to every breath. I hadn't listened to myself so attentively in a long time. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. From that moment on, I began to notice a lot. How quickly I get tired when there's no one to help. How heavy it is to carry bags. How difficult it is sometimes to just get up from a chair. But at the same time, I notice something else. I notice that I can cope. Slowly, clumsily, but on my own. And this discovery was both frightening and strangely reassuring. I started going out for walks. Not because I wanted to, but because the walls were closing in. I walked along familiar streets and looked at people's faces. Young, hurrying, confident that their lives were ahead of them. I caught myself envious, but not in an angry way. More like a quiet one. I remembered myself at their age and thought how little we value what seems endless. Sometimes I'd go into a store just to chat, to exchange a few words with the saleswoman, to hear a lively voice. In those moments, I acutely felt how a person can disappear when they're not seen. Not physically, internally, as if you're gradually being erased from everyone's space. The children would write short messages. How are you? Are you okay? I'd reply, yes, don't worry. It was true and not true at the same time, because everything seemed fine on the outside, but inside, I was growing the feeling that I had been left not just alone in the apartment, but alone in my own life, as if I was no longer part of their plans, as if my presence was something that needed to be temporarily removed so that nothing would interfere with their rest. I thought a lot. Old age is a time for thoughts. They come uninvited and don't leave right away. I remembered how I once chose between work and home, between fatigue and care. I wasn't always the perfect mother. I made mistakes. Sometimes I was harsh, sometimes too strict. But I never chose comfort over children. And this comparison was especially painful. One evening, I sat down at the table and pulled out an old album. The photographs were yellowed, but the faces in them were alive. I looked at them and suddenly felt like the woman in the pictures was still inside me. Not just my mother, not just my grandmother, just a woman, with her own story, with her own value. And this feeling was new. I hadn't thought of myself like this in a long time. That night, I allowed myself to cry for the first time. Not from self-pity, but from exhaustion. From trying too hard to be comfortable. From settling for less, just to not get in the way. The tears were quiet, but afterward, I felt better. As if I had finally admitted to myself that I was hurting. I realized that loneliness isn't always the absence of people. Sometimes it's the absence of a place in someone's heart. And that if I continued to remain silent, that place would remain empty. I didn't know what I would do next. I didn't know if I'd say anything to them when they returned. But I already knew one thing. I didn't want to disappear anymore. The thought was weak, uncertain, but it was mine. And in it lay the beginning of change. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, like footsteps down a morning corridor. I couldn't yet see the light ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't walking into nothingness. When they returned, I didn't find out right away. They didn't call me ahead, didn't warn me. One morning, my phone rang briefly with a message. We're home. 2 words. No joy, no question, no concern. I stared at the screen for a long time, as if it might add something on its own if I waited. But nothing else appeared. I sat at the table, my tea growing cold in front of me, and suddenly caught myself thinking, I no longer felt that sharp sting I'd felt before. There was no trembling, no rush, no urge to rush off. Instead, a calm had come. Cautious, fragile, but real. I realized that something inside me had shifted in that time, and it would never go back. I went to them anyway. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to look into their eyes as a different person, not the woman they'd left behind temporarily. The road seemed longer than usual. I walked slowly, stopping, catching my breath. Not from weakness, but from excitement. Because I knew there would be a conversation, and it would change a lot. My daughter opened the door. She looked tanned and rested, but when she saw me, she was momentarily taken aback. Something like guilt flickered in her gaze, quickly hidden behind a smile. She hugged me, but the embrace was cautious, as if she were afraid to hurt me, not knowing exactly where it hurt. We sat in the kitchen. Everything was the same as before. The same chairs, the same table. But I felt different here. Before, it was as if I was trying to shrink, to become invisible. Now I just sat, upright, without justifying my presence. My son-in-law came in later. He said hello. He sat across from me. He talked about the trip, the weather, the road. I listened and suddenly realized clearly, if I remained silent now again, I would be betraying myself, not them myself. And that would be worse than any argument. I began to speak quietly, not right away, pausing. The words came slowly but surely. I said it had been hard for me, that I felt abandoned, that being alone hadn't been a rest, but a trial. I didn't accuse. I simply told them how it had been, about the nights, about the fear. about how painful it is to realize that your life is an inconvenience to someone else's comfort. My daughter turned pale. She looked at me with wide eyes, as if hearing for the first time what had always been there. She tried to say something, to justify herself, to explain, but I gently stopped her. I said I wasn't looking for someone to blame. I was looking for the truth. And that truth is that I can no longer live as if my existence needs to be coordinated. My son-in-law was silent. His face was tense. He said they hadn't thought it would be so hard, that they simply wanted to rest. And in that moment, I suddenly realized something important. They truly hadn't thought. Not out of anger, not out of cruelty, but out of a habit of believing that I can endure, that nothing will happen to me, that old people are something strong, almost invulnerable. I said I could handle a lot, but not indifference, not silent dismissal. I said I didn't need constant attention. I needed space, in their lives, in their thoughts, not as an obligation, but as a living person. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. The room fell silent. This silence was heavy, but honest. It didn't contain the usual evasiveness. For the first time, I felt truly listened to.
I didn't ask.
I didn't demand. I said I'd come to my own conclusions, that I would live in my own place, that I didn't want to be temporarily housed, that if we were together, it would be by choice, not necessity. These words were difficult for me, but when I said them, I felt lighter inside, as if I had finally straightened up after years of hunching over. My daughter cried, quietly, genuinely. She said she didn't mean to hurt, that she hadn't noticed how things had gotten this far. I believed her, and I forgave. Not immediately, not completely, but sincerely. Because forgiveness isn't a gift to others. It's liberation for oneself. When I left, they stood by the door for a long time. My daughter hugged me tighter than ever. My son-in-law said that if I needed help, I could call any time. I nodded. But deep down, I knew I had already done the most important thing myself. Returning home, I walked slowly and suddenly felt a strange lightness. Not joy, not triumph,
but peace.
I was no longer the one who had been left behind. I was the one who had chosen not to disappear. That evening, I sat by the window and watched the lights come on. The world was the same, but I had become different in it. I realized that loneliness can be not a death sentence, but a starting point, that sometimes to be seen, you first need to see yourself. I didn't know what our path would be next, mine and theirs. But I knew for certain I would no longer settle for a life where my age made me invisible. And this knowledge held more power than I'd ever felt before. Now the days passed differently. Not faster or slower, just differently. I no longer count the time from bell to bell. I don't wait for someone to decide for me what's best for me. Mornings begin with silence, but this silence no longer frightens me. It has become mine. I open the window, let the air in, and every time I catch myself breathing deeper than before, as if there was space inside. I've learned to be alone again, not abandoned, but independent. These are two different things, although before I thought there was no difference. Abandonment is when you're forgotten. Loneliness is when you stay with yourself and aren't afraid of it. I've walked a long way toward this understanding, through pain, through doubt, through nights when it felt like the walls were closing in. But now I know I don't disappear, even when no one's around. My daughter calls more often. Sometimes just like that, for no reason. There's more caution in her voice, but also more genuine warmth. We don't revisit the days after they left, as if I could be put on hold. We don't pore over the past like old letters. It's already taken its place. Not as a grudge, but as a lesson. For all of us. I no longer try to be convenient. I don't try to anticipate desires, adapt, or smooth things over. If I'm having a hard time, I speak up. If I'm feeling good, I speak up too. And the world hasn't collapsed because of it. On the contrary, people have begun to hear me more clearly. It turns out that sometimes you just need to stop disappearing to be seen. In the evenings, I light the lamp and sit in a chair with a book. I read slowly, returning to lines if something resonates. I like that I'm not in a hurry anymore. Life hasn't ended, it's just shifted to a different pace. More honest, more attentive. Sometimes I think about those women who are now sitting in similar apartments with the same quiet fear in their chests. About those who are considered they can handle it. It's no big deal. She's strong. I would like to tell them, you have the right to be heard. You have the right to a place. Not for your merits, not for your past sacrifices, but simply because you exist. I no longer wait for someone to choose me. I chose myself. And in this choice, I found more peace than in all the compromises I made before. Old age is not about leaving. It's about clarity, about finally understanding what is important and what is not. Sometimes, before bed, I think, if all this hadn't happened, if I hadn't been left alone then, I might have continued to live half-heartedly, quietly accepting being in the background. It's scary to admit, but it was this very loneliness that became the turning point that changed everything. It didn't destroy me. It put me back together. I close my eyes and feel gratitude. Not for the pain, for the fact that it didn't break me. For finding the strength to stay alive inside. For the fact that even now, at this stage of life, I can take a step toward myself and not be late. And if tomorrow is quiet again, I know this silence is no longer empty. I am in it.